So where we left off, we talked a lot about mobile devices, and this is one that's happening quite a bit. So QR codes are pretty dangerous because we don't know where they're going to lead us. Does it really lead us to Bank of America's website, or does it lead us to a site that we've created that looks similar to it, and we're stealing your details? So be careful with those. It's easy to create QR codes, but they can lead to the wrong areas. So again, with those bit shorteners, and now we're seeing a huge amount of SMS spam, or we call it SPIM, S-P-I-M, instant messaging. But when you get a link, did you really win a prize on Amazon? Probably not. So again, it really takes that brain to think a little bit. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is true. So be careful of those things. So spam or our instant messages are great. I send a ton of texts and messages and videos and all kinds of things, but you have to be careful about what some of those are. And so we actually have an issue right now. So got my child a phone. One of them has a phone that, unfortunately, they recycle numbers. The number they recycled for my 9-year-old happens to be, as far as I can understand, a drug dealer down in the Fall City area, or a former phone of a drug dealer on that number. And she also apparently has some really bad credit. And so the amount of messages we're getting, we're going to have to switch her number out with our provider because she gets all kinds of these instant messages, literally hundreds of them a day, including links that are lead to some sites that are pretty ugly. So they also call the phone, several credit bureaus call it literally nonstop during the day. So I understand why this lady changed her phone. Go. There we go. So we have to think about how we're going to deploy these devices because they're here. They're here to stay. They're not going to go away. We can't just wave a magic wand and say, hey, we're not going to have Internet of Things devices. We're not going to have anything on our network. We're going to not have phones. But we need to think about how we control them. And if I put out this device, users can disable things unless I have a really good control on it. And we also have that issue of, hey, I gave my employees a smartphone, loaded it, now they're not employed with this anymore. How do I get it back? And so there's a lot of things with the model of that enterprise model mode. So we have to do some thinking about that. Some of your devices now have some things on them that make life a little easier to utilize. So Apple devices, there's some configuration tools. Android devices, there's some configuration tools. And so your parents, for those of you traditional age, your parents may have given you a phone and put things on it to secure it a little bit for you. Or in the case of me and my evil ways, to track where your children are at. So there are a lot of different mobile management tools out there that we can configure. So the one I'm actually using, and again, from a security standpoint, I would say, hey, don't buy your kids a phone until they're like 13. But unfortunately, I have a weird dynamic with my ex-wife who said, hey, they need to have phones. So I jumped out and I got ahead of that a little bit. And so we actually run an app. So I know I can't show it on the screen here, but this one's called MobiSip. And so from this app that's installed on all of their mobile devices, or any device that connects to the internet, it's connected to their Chromebooks, it's connected to their iPhones, it's connected to a couple of them, they have Kindles. It's all connected in here, and I can actually look and see how many times they picked up a phone. I can change their screen times. So for example here, I can shut off their screen times at 8 o'clock at night. I can just lock them. I also have you're shaking your head. That's horrible, isn't it? Huh. It is. Maybe. And I have the best button of all. I have a button that locks everything down and puts on the screen, hey, it's time to get together as a family. It actually turns off mine even. And for like dinner times, it's great. But we use this in business. So if you're working at a business and does it scare you that they would know everything you dial on your phone? Every place you surf? But that's that reality of working in that BYOD development. So some people will say, I don't want to have a phone from the company because they can know what I'm doing. Now, the flip side of that is, most IT departments are fairly understaffed. They're not really going to sit there and dig through all your stuff unless they have some reasonable suspicion. But it also brings up questions then, my phone, because I hook into the campus email, does it become those phones vulnerable or susceptible to Freedom of Information Request Acts? And so we made that decision with my wife because she got a stipend, and with the fact that there was a payment implied in there, it really meant that my wife's phone could be subject to a Freedom of Information Request Act by a newspaper to see everybody that she had texted, everybody that she had called, all of her texts and messages and everything else. So we do have to worry about it a little bit. But there's some things we can do. So on our own or on our company phones, we need to think about what do we want to do? Do we disable features? So Bluetooth, I waffle a lot on it. Bluetooth is fairly insecure and it scares me. But yet on the same thing, I can't listen to my phone in headphones unless I use something like that. So I even brought props. So unless I plug in these hideous Bose that are Bluetooth, I don't have any way to listen to my phone because they took out the regular headphone jacks. But that means my phone's turned on. Does that mean it's vulnerable? Yeah. So, screen locks. Making sure you turn on screen locks. And I know everybody in here has a passcode and a screen lock on their phone, right? Yeah. But I have had students in the past, they go, what do you mean? And yes, it's inconvenient because you have to do that screen lock. And I will say this pandemic has made it worse for some people because we bought iPhones that use now facial recognition. Well, facial recognition doesn't work very well with a mask. I would love it if they'd come out with a fingerprint reader again, and I would buy it in a heartbeat. But how are those set up? So after a limited number of attempts, do they factory reset? Do they wipe your data? So a lot of the times we can configure that to be the result. Is it a pain because you lost your phone, somebody tried to get into it, then it wiped it, and then maybe you even recovered it? Yeah. So things like PIN numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, bad PIN number. But when you only have 4 digits, you're somewhat limited. So think about what those numbers are. If you're using your date of birth, you're born in the 3rd month of 1997 or something, and you have 0397, that's information that I can find really quick by Google searching you, right? I can go out on Facebook and find your birth date. So we want to think a little bit about how secure we make those. So a lot of them now, and the Androids have the swipe patterns and some other things. Here's something that's really kind of weird and gross if you think about it. How many of you clean your screens every day or every couple of days? So if you don't, and you want to get paranoid, take your phone and look at it from a very shallow angle, and you can see all the buildup of your fingerprint oil and grease and goo from your ear when you put it up there. And you can actually see in a lot of cases, if you're logging into your phone repeatedly every day, you're going to be able to see where you touch it most. And if I know that those screen locks are only 4 numbers long, it's kind of easy to guess that. The same way, honestly, with doors that have a PIN code to type in to get into them. If you look at those pretty carefully, you can figure out if it's a 4-number system, which numbers are being used all the time. And if I'm down to 4 numbers, I don't have a whole lot of permutations of things to get in there. Kind of kind of frightening, but so here's where either you get paranoid or you think it's a great idea. In a lot of cases, phone companies and other data providers work closely with government agencies. They work very closely, and in fact, in some cases, they don't even need a warrant to tell information about a particular person or individual, depending on what you've signed up for. This data is often sold by third parties. So one of the uses that frightens me is they are selling off third-party data back to government agencies such as ICE, and they're allowing location data to be displayed. And nowhere when you sign that contract with Verizon or AT&T are they saying, hey, we're selling your data to somebody else, and law enforcement agencies are getting it. Now, the flip side of that, if somebody were to come into my house, kidnap my children, would I want the FBI to be able to track their cell phone? Yeah, but I'd like it to go through proper channels. And so we have to worry a little bit about this data and how it's moved around. I like my data to always be encrypted. When it's at rest, when it's in movement, when it's sitting there, no matter what I'm doing, I'd like it to be encrypted. Problem is, it's these companies that are in control of those keys in most cases. The one company that does kind of have a great track record so far, knock on wood, has been Apple. And it's frustrating for law enforcement. It's also sometimes frustrating to us because we say, why doesn't Apple just provide a backdoor into their phones? Because we have a terrorist who wanted to blow up a building. But the same hand, if Apple can unlock that data, can they unlock all the data on everybody's phones? Yeah. So, again, it's kind of an issue where there's not really a great overarching method. If we either have these backdoors into our computer systems and our phones, and they're open and available all the time for law enforcement, and you may think, well, I don't do anything wrong. But we've had a lot of things that have happened in terms of an incident that happens, and Google will get requested to send out data of every phone on Android that pinged a cell tower in that area. And they will start scrolling through all these people to try to figure out who was at the scene of a crime. Well, if this were truly a fair law enforcement system, and I think we have some biases built in there, and so we've certainly seen that some groups of people are much more likely to be accused of crimes. Do we right now have the ability to handle that? And I think we need to really think about that. So, where does that data land? Who's controlling it? How do I store that data? So, in our business sense, one of the things we like to do is compartmentalize or divide our data into separate locations. So, if I'm setting up phones for my employees, do I give them a personal data storage and a business data storage so that they're containerized? I would think that's good practice. So it avoids this idea of whose data is it, what are we doing with it? If I wipe your data off the system, it doesn't wipe out your personal data. You still have the items that you stored personally. And we know there's this, it looks like a big Venn diagram over whose data and who controls it and who owns it. And some of this is really kind of silly. We have our phones out all the time. How do I protect them from theft or from losing them? You know, if you're in a airport, keep it with you close so you know where it is. So, headphones. Think about that, but if I'm sitting there with a pair of unbelievably expensive Beat headphones on, is that going to tip somebody off that you probably have the higher end iPhone model or something? Yeah, so sometimes it's kind of handy to travel with cheap headphones or something. just so people don't notice what you're at. Be locationally aware. So if I'm near people that are bouncing me around, so I'm getting onto like one of the train or a bus or something like that when I'm traveling, probably a good idea to have it tucked tightly in your pants or somewhere that it's good. So make these hard to remove. Make it harder to remove. But you got to remember, people are very resourceful. You have a laptop bag and it's just sitting there behind your back, because it's kind of handy to buy these backpacks that'll hold your laptop. But you're on a noisy, crowded train in D.C., going to downtown D.C., are you going to notice if somebody just very carefully unzips your notebook and pulls it out of there? So make sure of where you're at. Make sure your surroundings. Think logically. Think, hey, I'm going to be a thief. What am I going to do? All right. I'm going to tell you to turn on those features. So on Apple, it's the Find My Phone. Android, I can't remember the name of it, but it's very similar. And you can actually then find your phone fairly quickly once you can get internet access, and you can see it. So most of the time, you also have the ability to remotely wipe. So if you have sensitive data on that phone, don't be afraid to wipe it, because hopefully you've done a cloud backup or you're backing up your data, right? Hopefully. So, other things we can do. So depending on the device, we may actually add other pieces to it. We may actually add a third-party alarm or locking device, depending on where it's at. So we're talking about how we're going to redo this lab, and if we magically got a ton of money. One of the items that kind of comes up is, do we adopt that new model of a laptop on a docking station? Well, if I just had all this lab full of 32 brand new laptops, is that a safe idea? What's going to happen to them pretty frequently? So we'd have to have some way to lock them down. So some of these are fairly interesting. So we can have third-party alarms that let out a really loud screeching sound. Usually I set them off myself, and they're a pain in the butt. So other things, what's really kind of neat is some of them now, even when you take enter an incorrect password, some of the phones and some of the laptops and other things now take a screenshot of you, take a picture of you. Well, that's not a bad idea. Hey, look, there's the person that stole my phone. But is it worth it to chase down somebody and tackle them over your iPhone? He's going, yes. I'm going to say probably not, just because you don't know, are they working alone? Are they working with a group of people? It's one thing to lose a phone. It's another thing to get seriously injured, end up in a hospital. So what other tools are there? So we're going to talk about, and I showed you the MobiSip in here, and it's kind of this idea of a mobile device management software. So that all my devices, so the MobiSip can run Android, can run Kindle, which is really a version of Android and Linux, Windows, Linux PCs, Macintosh systems. And so it can wrap all of those tools together in no matter what your platform. So we use a mobile device management system here, but only for the Apple devices, if I understand it correctly. So things like the Apple TVs and the iPads that are floating around, that they have a management tool for them. So you can do things like updates. Kind of handy if you know that you have 1,000 Chromebooks in your school system, that you can control them with one device. You don't have to bring everyone in to do updates. You don't have to bring in all those iPads. So configurations, updates, all those kinds of things can be done remotely, which is really nice. So in some cases, we can add new devices automatically. We can enforce things like encryption and privacy policies. We can connect to preferred Wi-Fi networks. So one of the things it can do is set up networks on there so only those networks are connected to. Kind of another safety piece in there. If we see one that's got an issue of some kind, we think it's infected or it's got some kind of vulnerability, you can quarantine and pull it and force it to shut off. You can even use it to the idea of sending out groups of messages. So you could message a group of users and say, hey, your laptop needs ready for its upgrade, and we're going to be turning it off in half an hour, for example. So corporate documents, you could force them to be stored on a network share instead of on that local device. You can see if somebody's installed software that you don't like or don't want on those systems, or has tried to break or jailbreak or hack the device. So maybe they've turned on third-party apps on Android phones, and we don't want that. You can actually flip that toggle and change that again. You can remotely wipe them. So, hey, we fired Jane Doe today. We're going to wipe her phone. Because from a corporate side, we've already stored all their data, and they haven't returned the phone to us, so phone's wiped out, no longer has service, doesn't do anything. Great, they have a phone they can't register and activate, but we have all the data and it's secured. So, this idea of mobile application, it's really the idea of now we're monitoring just the applications themselves. Well, software that we control. Most of them, they're kind of conjoined right now. So that MobiSip, for example, not only is it an MDM, it's actually MAM because it controls the software. So if you have an Apple phone, for example, and just because we have Apples, I'm a little more familiar with it, there are actually this idea of parental controls which serve the same purpose. And you can do some of that on your own in a group or as a company. So now we're able to put in apps. So, for example, at Peru, we could say these are the 25 apps that you can use on your tablet that's connected to our system. You can download them, install them, run them, but we don't have to put them on everything because maybe everybody doesn't need those apps, but it's in that library and allows you to run it. Kind of gives you those powers of what can I actually run. So it's a great way to configure systems. We can even do content management. Where are you going on the internet? Can we monitor and manage that? Yeah. So, again, although Janae disagrees that I tighten my children's life down to miserable, I can control where they go on their phones, right? So I can say, these sites are appropriate. And I found some that have slid through. And I've had to have some interesting conversations. So the other night, I happened to look, as I knew my child was up to something, because my 9-year-old gets this look. And you can just tell, I've done something I shouldn't have. And so we had a little conversation, and she goes, Dad, when you look at my phone, you're going to be kind of mad. I went, oh, okay. And I said, well, all the kids in school were talking about the Grammys and this song on there, and I didn't know what it meant. So I was Googling what WAP means. And I went, 9 years old. Oh, Lord Jesus. And I said many other things, but she was able to get around some of the restrictions, but wasn't able to actually see what it was, thank goodness. But she was, weirdly enough, able to pull the uncensored video down on YouTube. I'll be fixing that a little bit. But it's that idea of how do I protect my users? How do I protect my company? Because you certainly don't want a company, and you don't want to have a person out there, for example, making Twitter posts that are completely inappropriate. If you have an employee that's posting out there on Twitter that I support the idea that 5-year-olds, it's not really molestation. They made a choice. And this is actually a case that's going on right now in England on a thing. Do you want that tweet to be up? Do you want them to be accessing sites like that? Probably not. And I know we talk about the child pornography and those because it's kind of a hot button and touches is not the right word. It affects people greatly. But there's a lot of things out there that we probably should be careful about what our employees are looking for. The other thing we can do with this, not only can we see what they're doing or restrict some of what our employees are doing, we can also restrict a little bit how they move data around. You certainly don't want your employee who's working in the research lab to develop the latest version of corn seed to be exfiltrating all that corn seed recipes out to China or to another country or to another company. And so you can actually even have rules in there that look at what data is going in and out of that phone. Now, I don't have to worry about that with my children because they could care less about corn, but it is kind of an idea we need to think about. So, One of the things I do with my children, though, is I use the idea of geofencing. So we can put them in a list and say, hey, you can support this device only within a certain area. So if you leave this white spotted area or a geofenced area, it will alert you and say, hey, your device just left the Auburn, Nebraska area. Sometimes we do it where they only are active in a certain area for business purposes. So, hey, your phone will work and you'll be able to get into the system and pull out the codes to log into to this main server, but only if you're geofenced in the right area. So you can do applications that way. We can also extend out capabilities, so we can make things do new tasks. So the pandemic's been a great example of that. The phones were never designed as a way to track people that have or have not had vaccines, but you're going to find that I think we're going to do that pretty quickly. So we're extending new ideas, new capabilities. So some of the phones can actually use their cameras to detect body temperature, which is interesting. So we're adding those kinds of things. So we have all these other things, and we have this term Internet of Things. And so when I say Internet of Things, most of us think, well, I got this Alexa device. But it's more than that. It's our control system for the projectors in here. It's connected into a network. It's our thermostats. It's sensors all over this campus. It's the camera system, the sensors that are in that. In some places, we're very sophisticated lighting because we don't want to have to pay for extra lighting, nor do we want that light pollution. So the lights all are run by sensors. And it'll start lighting things up as you come into a building in different areas. So we have all these embedded devices everywhere, and they're embedded in places you wouldn't even think about. So they're in our cars. If you get in a car wreck today, most likely, it's almost like an airplane. They're going to pull the computer data to see what your speed was when you crashed into that train. So HVAC systems, all over they have sensors. So we can tell if something's going wrong on that HVAC system before it completely breaks. Maybe at your house even you have a very sophisticated heating and ventilation system. So the house we bought in Lincoln has this system from Carrier that has more sensors than I've ever seen. It measures indoor temperature, outdoor temperatures in almost every room. It's got a sensor. It measures the humidity. And all these little things, it actually goes out and grabs the weather channel for projected heat and cooling and all this. And it plans that. But I will say this, our heating bill for this last month when we had the 31 degree below zero temperatures, my gas bill was $83. My house in Auburn, which I kept at 45 degrees, the lowest I could run that thermostat down, because I'm just not there, about a similar size house, it was $200 and some for the gas bill on that one alone. So there's differences, and they can help. Now, there's other differences in the houses, obviously, but we see them in aircraft, medical devices. And that's where it starts to get a little scary. You probably know somebody with a pacemaker. You probably know somebody with embedded parts. How do we protect those? What happens if I can get control of a pacemaker? That's a little frightening, isn't it? What about even simple things like hearing aids? Hearing aids now in a lot of cases have Bluetooth interfaces to them. Can I change somebody's hearing aids? You think, oh, that's not going to hurt anything. What if it's the pilot of a plane you're in? What if it's your grandpa and he's waiting on a heart transplant and he's got one of these portable hearts in a suitcase essentially, and we manage to override it and tell it to turn it off? We use these sensors all over power plants, industrial plants of all kinds. So we look at the Natanz system when we very first started this class, and those IC systems were running the entire plant. Well, everywhere you look, there's control systems. The traffic lights in most cities are ran by some kind of control system. Water distribution, gas distribution, all of those systems have some vulnerabilities. When we merge them all together, there's a term you're going to see called SCADA. And SCADA is really just supervisory control and acquisition. It really means, hey, we're doing this like single pane. We're trying to control all these systems together. So if I went into a large manufacturing plant, you're going to find all these systems in our building are ran by SCADA. But it gets even better. So here's an example of a car and some of the things, and there's actually far more than that now, in these vehicles. And we've already found that some of them are vulnerable. We've decided we need to be able to update our system remotely, but that also means there's a backdoor path in. And now we've decided, hey, we're going to have in-flight entertainment. We've got a backdoor in. So some of these things, if we were able to reprogram just a little bit, so think about that adaptive cruise control. If you've never ridden one with adaptive cruise control, it drives me crazy because I'm a control freak. But the adaptive cruise control modulates your speed based on the cars ahead of you. But what if we changed a couple lines of code? And instead your car just slammed into somebody else at 80 miles an hour. And in fact, that movie IT that I talked about, that's one of the things they do, is they are able to take over a vehicle. And in some of the vehicles, it is very possible at this point. Think about how you're plugged in. You no longer have physical connection to the throttle. It's all electronic. If you have the capability to do a self-parking in your car, if it just turns the wheel and backs up into a parking space, how hard would it be to extend that control over the power steering to cause a car wreck? Or to lock up your brakes while you're driving down the highway? So we see these, and they're buried in everywhere. So CPUs are all over the place. And now we're making faster processors, burying them in even smaller things. So we have essentially an entire computer on a tiny chip the size of my thumb in some cases. So these embedded systems are hiding everywhere. When you go to an ATM, it's an embedded system. It's got software that runs in there, and we hope it's secure, but is it always? No. I'd like it if the ATM would just spit out extra $100 bills every month, but it doesn't seem to ever work that way. Well, what other things do we have? So we talk about IoT. Coffee makers. Why does my coffee maker want to be connected? Well, because it will sense when you wake up and sense movement and start brewing you coffee. Great. Keyless entry into the house. It's kind of handy, I will tell you that. It's pretty handy if you have it set up correctly on a system where your door lock, as you walk up with your phone in your pocket, it recognizes you and unlocks the door automatically for you. That's pretty handy. What about your washing machine and dryer? So my washing machine and my dryer in Auburn at the house, I went a little crazy, and they talked to each other. And so the washer says these are the settings that he selected based on, he asked a question about stains, and the dryer already knows what's going to come in there. So it presets itself for that. And then it will send me a text message and say, hey, your laundry's dry. Do I need that? No. And when I bought a new washer and dryer for our other house, I went kind of cheap because I didn't want to spend that kind of money again. What about systems on you or trying to make your life better? Light bulbs all around us. What are we talking about light bulbs? Most of you probably have some smart lighting already. And it's a way into your network. So how do I use them to my advantage? How do I use them to a disadvantage? Because we do need to think about controlling them. But this is that idea of we're now getting sensors closer and closer and closer. So think about, you probably all know somebody who's got diabetes. And for example, type 1 diabetes in a small child, it's hard to manage. If we could come up with a system that would on real time manage the levels and inject or not, and we're getting closer and closer. We're working on those systems as we speak. We have hearing aids that adapt to your environment. I think fairly quickly you're going to see some vision things that are going to be pretty transformational. We already see systems that you can use if you're completely black and white colorblind that you can see in color. Or we put in hearing aids that actually replace your entire ear, the cochlear implants, and we're getting better and better and better at it. Well, now we can do all different kinds of sensors. And I think when I teach this class in 2 or 3 years, one of the things we're going to talk about is hacking the human. How do we hack people? And I think you're going to start to see that become more and more an issue. We're building systems now for people who are paralyzed, that they're able to control a set of artificial legs. What happens if we can control those? What happens if we control that pacemaker or your blood glucose? So that idea that people don't get injured by hacking is starting to lose some of its relevance. And in fact, even in the hospital systems now, if I could get into that system and change somebody's med order, it could be a very serious event. So, we're seeing a lot of new development. You're seeing the ability, for example, in paraplegics and quadriplegics. We're doing all kinds of stimulators and sensors and different things so we can try to restore functionality, and that's a great thing. But how do we deal with all this? We have all these systems out there, and in most cases they're built not for security, they're built to see how cheap can I produce a light bulb. How much security do you think goes into an $8 light bulb that's connected to your network? Oh, great. But on the other hand, I have to be able to sell it, and if I'm pricing it at $100 and actually have some security in there, probably not going to sell as many. So, we have to come up with some ways around that. One of the ways we do that is we typically put all our IoT devices on their own, either separate, completely separate LAN, or we use VLANs. Somehow we contain it. Just like we did personal data and business data, we try to wrap those into separate containers. So, we're going to talk a lot about how to protect those devices in the next couple of weeks. How do we fix some of these issues? But the reality, a lot of it's common sense. If that text message sounds too good to be true, don't click on it. If you buy a light bulb for $8 and plug it into your network and it's wanting to know all kinds of personal information about you when you set it up, maybe you should rethink, do I really need a light bulb that I can turn off and on with my phone app? Now, in my case, I say, yeah, I got to have that. But I also have mine separated off, so they're on their own VLAN. And most people don't have the luxury or the ability to do that. All right. As stated before, for this week, there is, in the wrong spot. There is not an assignment in here, but there is a discussion board assignment for you to do. Somewhere down here, week 10. We're all the way down here. And so we're looking at the idea of cybersecurity on IoT devices. So you'll find an additional article. Make sure you have a cogent response. And then you have to respond to one whole student this week. All right. Any questions?